Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining me today. My name is Conrad. I'm a senior cybersecurity analyst, intelligence analyst rather, at GE. Started out as an incident responder, and now I help to track over 80 actors. And when I'm not doing attack operations, I'm also focused on attacks affecting the ICS space. So coming up here in June, I'm going to be going out to Edinburgh to present on those issues. So if you're there, please make sure to say hi. So in this presentation, I'm going to be discussing how and why GE has integrated the attack framework into our daily operations, and also cover how operationalizing attack has served as a workflow and how it has benefited our incident response efforts. During the presentation, if anyone has any questions, please just shout them out. I've got some vision issues, so if you raise your hand to ask a question, I may not see it. So please just shout it out. I don't mind the interruption. So, okay. So in this presentation, I'll be giving a high-level overview, introduction to the attack framework. I'll be talking about why GE has adapted this framework into our daily operations, how Intel-Driven Defense is used by GE, and how we measure success with the attack framework. I'll talk about some of the lessons learned from integrating attack into our daily operations. We'll wrap up with some key takeaways and any questions that you may have there at the end. So, okay. So just a quick background about attack. MITRE had developed this framework, and basically it's used to track the behaviors or the actions that an attacker performs at various stages of an attack. So and I know this is an eye chart, it's much worse in real life. There's the framework consists right now of 12 tactics going across the top, and currently there are 244 techniques that align within those tactics. And since I can't even show all of them on one slide anymore, we'll just kind of zoom in here to show a small sampling. So the framework, you can use this in your operations to map out an attacker's actions at various stages of an intrusion or an attack. So identifying the sequence of behaviors provides a clear picture of an attacker's capabilities. And over time, by creating this behavior map, you can identify shifts in an actor's TTPs. Additionally, attack can help to identify techniques that are most often seen within your organization, and also those which represent the highest risk to your organization. And each of the techniques on here has its own page, and it contains a whole lot of information there that can be used to pair an action with a particular technique. So we're going to be focusing on PowerShell a lot in this presentation. So here's the PowerShell technique page. And MITRE's done a great job in explaining in the description how PowerShell can be used maliciously. So up here on the right, this ID is the technique ID. You'll be seeing that a little bit later. Also on the right, please make note of the data sources. These are a great reference for you to identify which logs should be collected in order to detect, in this case, malicious PowerShell activity. So on each technique page, There's also a section here to reference how this technique has been used maliciously in the wild. In this particular example, most of the activity there is from APT actors, auto-IT, or auto-IT, if you prefer, at the bottom there. But each of these references are clickable. So it'll take you to a report that a vendor has put out, and you can see how that's been used. Also on each attack page, MITRE has put out a section for mitigation and detecting the particular behavior. So here, for PowerShell, they're talking about enabling an execution policy, or restricting or disabling the WinRM service. And then when it comes to the detection, logging and policy changes can be used for detection purposes. So it's a really great resource. If you haven't checked it out, I greatly encourage you to do so. So I'll explain how we use the attack framework a little bit later. But first I want to go into why we decide to integrate this into our operations. So this is the pyramid pane, and it's a representation of the difficulty required in detecting these categories and the level of difficulty it also takes for an attacker to change them. So at the bottom here, the hash, the IP address, the domain names, they're easy to detect, and they're equally as easy for an attacker to change from one campaign to another. I lost my spot. In doing so, these are very easy. At the top there, the TTPs are very, very difficult to detect using traditional indicator of compromise-based detection strategy. So a little bit about our background. We've collected over 3 million indicators of compromise in our threat database. And our old approach was to deploy high-fidelity signatures for these critical indicators. And although we had a very, very strict deployment policy, we ended up with a substantial detection signature base. And this resulted in our incident responders having to battle analyst fatigue. There were so many alerts firing in the console. So for example, in working one of these, if we had an IP address that an attacker used, it might be a shared infrastructure. And if that were the case, it would require additional correlation searches to bring together other atomic indicators, such as pairing a domain name with a particular user agent. And we found that it was far too easy for actors to change these indicators, which defeated our existing indicator compromise-based detections. So, we learned that an indicator compromise approach for detection was reactive. And, in this strategy, we were limited in what our signatures could detect. So, as an example, here's a very simple script. It's basically copying the CIRT utility, which is a Microsoft utility, into the temp directory, and then it renames it. And in doing so, it's trying to just do a simple defense evasion against name-based detections. So from a traditional indicator compromise signature, we wouldn't be able to detect, to to detect something as simple as renaming this. So we needed a way to detect the parts of an attack, the parts of an intrusion that wouldn't change from incident to incident. So to focus on this, we automated the traditional indicator of compromise processing, and we focused on the behavioral-based detection strategy. So the behavioral-based detection capabilities allow for a more robust signature base, and these are able to detect malicious actions regardless of whether it's an APT actor, a cybercrime actor, if it's commands being executed by a script, or if it's hands-on keyboard. It doesn't matter how the behavior is occurring to an extent. So indicator compromise-based detections, as I mentioned, can result in a large signature base. And these indicators, these signatures, are reactive. They're only able to detect what was already seen. So for example, with an emotet campaign, for example, a bank Trojan, you're going to have a hash, a URI, a domain. You can write detection signatures based on these indicators. But what happens is the next go around, the next variant, all these change. And so all that effort, all that energy, all that time spent creating detection for those indicators is no longer effective at detecting the same type of threat, the same malware family, the same campaign. It doesn't work like that. So you have to go through the whole thing again. You have to create detections for the hashes, for the domains, or the URI, the domains, and so on. And it's a game of catch up. So behavioral based is a little bit more robust. It's more dynamic. And in doing so, it retains its fidelity over time. And you're able to detect more things, more malicious actions with fewer signatures, which helps in the analyst fatigue. So one point about doing behavioral-based detection is that you're going to need some level of host monitoring to pull this off. Most of the behaviors that are in the attack framework occur at the host level. So you're going to need some kind of EDR solution to get the most bang for your buck in implementing this in your own organization. So in this section, I'm going to touch on our operations and how GE Intel processes reports using ATT&CK. And just a quick overview of how GE is structured. We've got a very large group of employees, group of assets, and so we have a Intel team, and we have our incident response team that's part of the CIRT. And the Intel team produces briefings and supports the CIRTs in their incident response operations. So to do this, we process external reports and internal incidents in order to produce intelligence. And that intelligence is then used by the incident responders when it comes time to creating new signatures. And it also, it's also utilized when it comes to working alerts or incidents as well. So here's a screenshot of a sample report. And in here, we're identifying in this darker yellow line here a behavior that aligns to attack. So in here, it's talking about an API calling PowerShell that's being run through the command line. And in the bright yellow box, this square here, it shows the annotations that we make to the report by the Intel analysts. So the annotation includes the technique number, the tactic, the technique, execution notes, along with patterns and trends. The execution notes are going to be the technical details that the incident responders use when they're developing custom content. And the patterns and trends section is going to be more of a narrative. It's going to be particularly important to make note of if a report is describing something but doesn't give the technical details of how that's occurring. So this is our in-house tool called Tiamat, and it was developed to organize and catalog attack data from, again, internal instance and external reporting. And all this information is put into Tiamat by the Intel team. So the incident responders will use this information here when it comes to developing behavioral-based detection. And Intel will use this information in identifying patterns and trends or shifts in TTPs by a particular actor. So Tiamat also serves as a knowledge base for incident responders to use when working alerts. So here, this screenshot is showing an example of some of the information that we've already entered into Tiamat. And each of the reports here has a little drop down to show the particular indicators, the particular actions, the behaviors, the tactics, techniques that were input from that source. Excuse me just a second. So once we've annotated a report, which is done by the Intel team, it's put into Tiamat. And information about the report is recorded in the top section, while the bottom half here contains the behaviors that were identified by the analysts. I want to call attention to the execution notes again, just to reiterate, this is where the technical details go. Your command line arguments can go there, your PowerShell scripts, and so on. The patterns and trends, again, are really going to help in the event that you're looking at in a report that doesn't say how necessarily the credentials were harvested, for example. Also, we identify which tool is associated with the behavior that we're working on. And this helps to identify not only which tools that an actor is using, but also which behaviors that tool is responsible for. So once the collection process is completed, we work with the incident responders to analyze and exploit all the information that's in Tiamat. So the incident responders will take this intelligence and turn it into custom content development for deployment across our enterprise environment. So when they're working in Tiamat, incident responders can filter on a technique that will be used in their detection creation. So in this case, filtering on the PowerShell technique returns all the entries from both internal reports or internal instance and external reports. And here we're filtering on PowerShell technique, and the highlighted section also shows the malware family associated with these particular entries as Zyklon, Zyklon. I'll show that here in just a minute. You're beating me to the punch. So also, just a note here on this slide, it's possible to filter using other columns as well, depending on what we're trying to search for. So when it comes to creating a behavioral signature, we start with developing a hypothesis. So we state what we're trying to detect. So in this example, we're trying to detect the removal of event logs or indicators of compromise by utilities being run from the command line. The incident responder will determine if the supporting execution notes are of high enough fidelity to be used for the detection. Also, in the gap section there, they would note there if there's a tooling gap, for example. So maybe one of our detection tools isn't able to collect logs for a particular source that was mentioned in the data sources earlier. The other thing that they can put there is if there's an intelligence gap, in which case the Intel team would go and search for examples to support the hypothesis. So using Tiamat to support the hypothesis creation, the responder goes and searches for entries, in this case, disabling security tools. And that's under the technique, which aligns with KC5 and falls under the tactic defense evasion. They'll then view the particular details of the results here and identify which techniques from the execution notes, excuse me, I said that wrong, which execution notes they can use to support that behavioral creation. So to do that, they just click on the little magnifying glass there, and you'll see this. So for example, here this section highlighted is an example of those technical execution notes that they can use. So once they have collected all the technical examples from internal instance and external reporting, we'll take that information and create a search to run in our SIM. So in doing so, this search is looking for instances of the command line or PowerShell being run with, using those processes. And depending on the results that are returned, it may be necessary to tune the search if there's, for example, too many false positives. So when the hypothesis testing phase is done, we go ahead and save that signature into Tiamat, and it's deployed in the SIM. So the behavioral-based signature detects on the defense evasion tactic and the file deletion and remove indicators from host techniques. So if you go back to the framework and you look under the defense evasion tactic, those two techniques will be there. So the signature alerts on cmd.exe or PowerShell running those processes that attempt to remove indicators of compromise from host. So this search name and the description of the rule increases the fidelity of the signatures by providing the responders the ability to see exactly what the rule is trying to detect on. Also, they are able to go in and view the original source that the rule was created from so that they can see that example. So this helps new responders, new incident responders, to quickly come up to speed and bridge that technology gap because they can see exactly what the rule is trying to detect. So far, I've been talking about how the CIRT and the Intel team have used Tiamat. But I want to make the point that to implement this in your own organization, if you're a small team, you don't have an intel team to support your incident responders, that's okay. You can still do the same type of information or the same type of operation, just at a smaller scale. Also, you don't need a great big tool like Tiamat. It helps tremendously, and I'll show you here in just a minute some of the things we're able to do with it. But to integrate all this information, you can work out of spreadsheets. That's how we did to start out with. And it sucks, it's a pain, but it works. And if you're not, if your team is not big enough to support this, if you don't have the time to implement all these actions, start out with a spreadsheet. It works. But that said, Tiamat does provide some additional capabilities beyond organizing and categorizing the attack data that we've input. So in this sample, we're showing a heat map of our coverage. And so it's very important to be able to gauge if a gap exists due to a limitation versus a gap in intelligence coverage. So this map also helps to determine which techniques should be prioritized in detection writing. Okay. This is kind of tough to read, but basically it's the same graph on the left and right, just with different portions highlighted. So the inner ring here is showing examples of different detection platforms. The middle ring is showing the different data sources that particular detection platform can detect. And then the outer ring, which is over here on the right, is showing our confidence for that detection tool to be able to collect those data sources. So this is pretty important. I'd almost go vital in understanding what your tooling, what your detection platforms are able to detect. So in this sample here, this detection platform, there in the purple, the inner ring, it's responsible for a large chunk of different data sources. And here in this example on the right, if we follow that out all the way to process monitoring, this is showing that this made-up tool, for example, is responsible for 100% of that monitoring. So by identifying what your tooling is able to see, it will also help to identify any gaps that you may have. And it can also be used when you're evaluating new detection platforms. So, also in Tiamat, we have the ability to track which behaviors we observe the most often from external reports, partner sharing, internal instance, and so on. So here, this chart is showing that PowerShell is the most observed technique, and tracking this type of information while combining it with the previous data that I showed on the previous two charts, it helps to identify which techniques pose the greatest threat, which techniques you're getting hit with the most, and you can also track, which techniques are being covered by your signatures. So combining all this information here, the signature coverage, the technique map, and the confidence data can all feed into a prioritization model. And when I was first talking about attack, there are 244 different techniques. Oh my gosh, where do you even start from a detection writing standpoint? So being able to map all this back into a model like this can help to identify which techniques are most important to you in your organization. So here we're showing a breakdown for the technique for DLL32 and the confidence that we have in detecting this by these detection platforms and by those data sources. So the prioritization of a technique serves as a workflow for incident responders when developing new detection. And this information can be used to identify gaps in existing tooling when evaluating new detection platforms. Also on the left is some other criteria that can help to feed into prioritizing a particular technique aside from just your existing coverage. Any questions? Okay. So up to this point, I've discussed at a pretty high level how GE uses intelligence-driven defense. Basically, that's using whatever sources you can, internal sources, external sources, in order to improve your security hygiene, in order to improve your defenses, and using that with the attack framework. So in this next section here, I'll discuss some of the challenges that we identified and overcame. So implementing implementing a intelligence-driven defense program for your organization requires, of course, leadership buy-in. And they need to understand that, attack and integrating this into the operations, it's going to be a new process, and it's going to take some time before that there are measurable results. So this is a process that's going to take time to integrate into your daily operations. So take the time to socialize, this type of program with management and also with the analysts, explaining that. My time up? Sorry, that was mean. I lost my train of thought. Explaining to them that this is, a security standard attack is, and it's going to serve as a standard language communication method to talk about incidents both with your analysts and also with your leadership. Explain, why you're doing this and what the benefits will be. Also, this is a shift in historical security operations mindset. It's going to take some time and it's going to take some effort to accept this change. So don't expect analysts to just start using attack. It takes some time to become familiar with this framework. 244 techniques. That's going to take some time to get familiar with, especially at an operational level. So when it comes to annotating the reports or working from an internal incident, recognize that you're going to need some training sessions. Not everyone is going to categorize a particular action consistently the same way as everyone else. So it's going to take some time to get everybody up on the same level. And also, the same thing when it comes to detection writing. So it's going to take a while to get everybody up to the same standard. So for both approaches, having some kind of quality assurance method or program process can help to reduce the time to get everyone up to speed. So we're getting into the key takeaways here, and I just want to talk about that the biggest benefit of intelligence-driven defense using the attack framework to develop these behavioral-based signatures is from the incident responder standpoint. You're going to have much higher fidelity signatures, and in your documentation, those responders can go back and see exactly what the rule is trying to detect, go back to the original source, see the example, reference the attack framework, and understand what is happening in the console. So traditional IOC processing, it's still necessary, but you can automate this. You can spend more time on developing these behavioral-based signatures. The intel-driven defense using the attack framework, it helps to detect threats where IOCs may not exist. So whether that's a new malware family entirely or just a new variant, looking at behaviors that, okay, so a fish comes in and a user executes a macro, and that macro launches PowerShell, and that PowerShell script is run through the command line, and it pulls down a file, and it creates persistence through a shortcut. Those things don't just happen once. They happen over and over and over again across various different attacks, different malware families. And so creating these signatures, you're not going to have to continually play catch up like you do with traditional indicator compromise-based detections. You can write it once, tune it, get it right in the sweet spot, and it will keep detecting and detecting and detecting new malware, hands on keyboard, APT, cybercrime, it's all good. So also, one thing that the attack framework has done is it's helped to identify and prioritize detection for techniques which pose a higher risk. When we're doing indicator compromise-based signatures, we're doing it for malware families and C2s and different URIs, that sort of thing. But it was very difficult to identify, out of a huge list of indicators, which one is the most important. In this process, when we implemented it, it greatly increased our true positive rate, and it helped to reduce our analyst fatigue. It also made it much easier for our incident responders to investigate and alert in the SIM and categorize it as a true positive or false positive. So we used the attack framework in creating correlated behavior signatures as well, and that basically identifies a sequence of behaviors that occur within a particular time frame. And this has been great in identifying, for example, enumeration scripts. So, hey, who am I? Your net commands, your IP configs, your net stats, that kind of stuff. Oftentimes, those are run through a script that an attacker launches, and they often occur within a very short amount of time within each other, or from each other. So how are we doing on time? 10 minutes, great. Okay. And then lastly, this process using attack, developing behavioral-based detection, it's helped us to quickly identify, as I mentioned, what the signature is trying to detect, and it's helped to identify, which techniques that an attacker may use is most important to us. So, but again, the greatest, from an incident response standpoint is bridging that technology gap, or that technology knowledge gap. And then from an intel processing standpoint, it's helped to identify, which techniques are being used over and over again by our APT actors and which ones, change when there's a shift in TTPs. So, questions? Yeah, we looked at that in Caldera, and there was another one that we looked at as well, and they're great, but we need something that would integrate with our tools so that we could automate, and so that's why we went with Tiamat. So it's been very, very, very beneficial in that respect. So.
How long was your
So it's still ongoing. I started out doing a complete mapping of one of our actors from an internal incident. And I mapped out, every single tool that they had used, all of our detections, and looked at tooling gaps and what our detection platforms can see and can't see. And that kind of went together as a proof of concept to move to the behavioral-based detection writing. And then when we started out in spreadsheets, we really didn't have a good way to work from the spreadsheets because we had so many teams integrating it, so we had to have a master spreadsheet. And from there, we started to develop signatures for behavioral-based, but there was also the issue of getting everybody up to speed from a operations standpoint where we're all understanding, different entries from reports, from partner sharing, and categorizing them the same way. So that was a process. And then also from a creation standpoint, signature creation, we had several proof of concepts to make sure that this is something that we wanted to invest in and go forward with. So as I said, we're still in that, but to get up and rolling, it took maybe a couple months. Anything else?
What do you use, like, in one of the slides?
Right. So.
Can you elaborate a bit?
So the vendors were for detection platforms. So that wasn't from the intelligence sources that we were using, for example. So were you talking about the prioritization model? Were you talking about this?
Yeah.
Okay. So these are sample detection platforms. So an AV vendor, an EDR solution, a cloud provider detection, something along those lines for the purposes of this slide.
What do you use as source?
A variety. So we use open source reporting, we use partner reporting, we use some closed sources. So and also our internal instance we use to enhance our coverage. Did that answer your question?
Tiamat is proprietary.
It is.
There are
I don't have the answer on that. So it may be something considered down the line, but I don't have any indication on that. Okay, thank you very much.